Hey Unwrappers, what Christmas gift do you get the person who has everything, including a healthy sense of curiosity about current affairs and culture? The answer, of course, is a subscription to The Week, to keep your friends and family up to date on the big issues and also to entertain them with lighter stories they may have missed. Well, this December, we're giving Unwrap listeners a special discount on Christmas offers from The Week. You can get 6 weeks completely free and then save an extra £5 on a quarterly subscription for any package. Visit theweek.com/flash24 to find out more and enter promo code FLASH24 to claim your offer. That's promo code FLASH24 at theweek.com/flash24. It's the week ending Friday the 13th of December, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Bashar al-Assad fleeing to Moscow as his regime collapses after 24 years, the father and stepmother of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif found guilty of her murder, and FIFA announcing Saudi Arabia as the location for the 2034 Men's Football World Cup. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Rebekah Evans, from BBC Sport, journalist Emma Smith, and we welcome back journalist, campaigner and counsellor Elizabeth Carr-Ellis. Has Christmas begun in your households finally, and if so, is it because you're watching a Christmas movie, and if so, which one is it?
It has to be Muppets Christmas Carol, the greatest Christmas film and the greatest Dickens adaptation of all time. I
100% back you on that. It's the best Muppet film. It is the best version of that story. Christmas does not begin until I see it. Elizabeth, what do you like to get your Christmas vibes on with?
I'm either the Alistair Sim Christmas Carol.
Oh, lovely.
Because it scares the pants off me. Or Bridget Jones, which is appropriately talking about big pants. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a Richard Curtis animated Christmas movie as well, isn't there, this year on Netflix? That Christmas. Rebekah, you're nodding. Have you seen it?
I haven't. My two Christmas go-tos are either Elf, which I think is the best Christmas film of all time, or The Holiday to star Jude Law.
Okay. I mean, these are all worthwhile contenders, but Emma had it with The Muppet Christmas Carol. Anyway, Elizabeth, you are up first with your story of the week, and a warning, in this story we're going to be talking about sexual assault. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
If you're a woman, you snooze, you lose your day in court.
Hi, I'm Lauren Spencer and I am a sexsomniac, which basically means I suffer from a condition called sexsomnia. Not only do I sleepwalk, grind my teeth, talk in my sleep, do a bit of cleaning and so on, sometimes I get a bit naughty in my sleep, so I have to kind of double lock the bedroom door when I'm staying away with one of those long kind of cable rope type locks. It can be a bit embarrassing. It's awkward because I'm out of control. I don't remember doing it, and yet I know I did it. So a bit of a strange one, really. Quite a rare thing as well, I think.
Content creator model Lauren Spencer talking about her sexsomnia diagnosis to the website of which national newspaper, Elizabeth? You'll never guess.
Oh, it could only be The Sun.
It was The Sun. That's how they treated that story of sexsomnia. Why is it back in the headlines this week?
It's back because far from being a Mrs. Tit-a-ye-not joke, sexsomnia is becoming a very real issue amongst rape cases. Not amongst rape cases as such, but amongst rape cases being dropped in our courts. Sexsomnia was first diagnosed officially in 2005. That's when it was recognised. But over the years, it's been built up more and more as a defence in rape cases. And the reason why I've highlighted is a story this week in The Observer reported on a Freedom of Information request that found out that the CPS isn't collecting any data on how many rape cases are actually being dropped or collapsing because of a sexsomnia defence.
So how do we know that it's a real issue if they're not collecting the data?
An investigation by The Observer earlier this year found that in the last 30 years, there have been 80 cases of sexual assault or some sort of abuse where either sleepwalking or sexsomnia was used as a defence. 51 of those came in the last decade and 8 were in the last year alone. And it also found that in roughly 60% of those cases where sexsomnia was claimed by the defence, a not guilty verdict was reached.
Okay. Before we get into all the repercussions of that then, Emma, can you give us a kind of 101 on what sexsomnia is and how it gets diagnosed?
Yes, so basically sexsomnia is the sleep disorder in which a person engages in sexual activities during sleep. It's kind of parasomnia in which a person might do sort of unusual activities while sleeping. The most common one is sleepwalking. Obviously, this is sleep sex, basically. In the case of insomnia, people can do anything from, grabbing their partners to masturbation. It can be diagnosed sort of through a combination of clinical history, sleep study. Often patients are required to do their own sort of like sleep diary kind of thing. And then it can be treated through medication, sleep hygiene, sort of, creating better environments for sleep, reducing stress, things like that. So it is a real thing.
So, Rebekah, when it's used in court as a defence for the alleged assailant, how does that affect the victim? How can they answer that claim of sexsomnia? You were attacked because you were with a sexsomniac.
Yeah, it must be, I imagine, very hard, particularly because I think there are a lot of kind of emotional and ethical implications that sort of need to be borne in mind when sexsomnia is being used as a defence in court. Now, understandably, as we've touched upon, this is a genuine condition and it is more obscure, but I think particularly for victims, it's worrying because I think it has the potential to be exploited by those kind of nefarious individuals who are looking for that get out of jail free card in what is a very, very serious crime. It's often hard for people to come forward, especially for women to come forward and to feel confident enough to come forward with their accounts, probably out of fear of being disbelieved or discredited in the court system. We've seen how many rape cases are dropped or ultimately end in a not guilty verdict. So I think the sexsomnia defence can lead to skepticism about the victim's account, essentially implying that whatever was done to them wasn't intentional. And that's obviously quite a powerless situation to be in as a victim in an already very challenging set of circumstances.
And in that sense, Elizabeth, it's similar to what's called the rough sex defence, isn't it? In cases where people have been the victim of violence in sexual assault, people sometimes say, oh, it was a game that went too far, or, there was a consensual element of sadism, but we overstepped the mark. People will start to use this in a knee-jerk way, even if sexsomnia isn't something that affects them, is the fear.
That is very much the trouble. It is being used in this, as Rebekah said, get out of jail free clause. Although I am very happy to say a judge in one of the cases did sort of say to the guy, you're having a joke, yeah, mate, for this sexsomnia defence. The trouble is, it is being used as that I didn't do it, Gov. Sexsomnia made me do it, so therefore I am innocent. The worst case was this brilliant campaigner called Jade McCross in Nethercourt, and she is the reason why The Observer has been pulling this up so much. She says she was raped when she was asleep after a night out when she was 24. She waited 3 years for her case to come to court, and 13 days before she was due to go to trial, the CPS dropped it and said expert doctors had said she could have been suffering from sexsomnia.
She could have been, as the victim? She could have been,
as the victim. She had never been diagnosed. She said, apart from a questionnaire, she'd never met the legal expert.
What?
And she actually sued the CPS for dropping the case, and this summer was awarded £35,000 in compensation for it. She's also said recently that they have promised to send her a letter saying what lessons they've learned from this case, but she hasn't heard anything from them, which is why the Freedom of Information request is so worrying, because it's saying, the CPS perhaps is not looking at this as robustly as they claim they are.
Right. So that goes back to what you were saying, Emma, about diagnosis. It is a real condition. It is possible to diagnose it. You can look at case histories, but we've got situations where clearly guardrails aren't in place to properly investigate whether someone has sexsomnia, and that's even being applied to people without their consent, people just assuming they have sexsomnia.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can sort of like be easily exploited and sort of becoming one of those sort of excuses that gets reeled out in sort of sexual assault.
But it shouldn't be, right? For the reasons that you said, like, it should be evidenced. I mean, either someone has a history of doing this dozens of times in their lives and their ex-partners can attest to it, or they don't.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the issue. The fact that it's not a particularly well-known medical condition means that it can be more easily exploited, and you have the fact that, for example, if a patient thought they had sexsomnia, and so the treatment was, okay, keep a clinical sort of diary of your sleep pattern, that could easily be sort of manipulated because of sort of like if it's a person sort of like looking after their own care almost, it could easily be sort of like used to sort of create this sort of false narrative. And I mean, in terms of the case of the CPS, I mean, they've said that they're going to robustly interrogate sexsomnia claims, but you can't do that if you're not keeping any data. You can't sort of like work out exactly who's making these claims, whether there's a pattern of this being used as a new excuse, whether it's real or not. And you can't do that if you don't have any numbers, if you don't have any data. So they're saying that they're going to robustly interrogate these claims. They're clearly not.
What is the reason, Elizabeth, that the CPS don't have stats on how often sexsomnia is used as a defence?
They say that they just don't do it in cases at all, that they look at each case individually and see what lessons can be learned from it, so they don't feel the need to keep statistics for how it's doing. With a rise of 40% of rape cases being dropped this year, I would suggest that they start looking at reasons why rape cases are being dropped and seeing if there is such a pattern such as sexsomnia, because otherwise women are going to be fighting for justice that never arrives.
Yes, and what is the repercussion of that, Rebekah?
It means women languishing in the justice system for years and not getting the justice that they deserve. I mean, I touched upon the fact that victims often feel powerless within sexual assault cases, primarily because the very act of the sexual assault has robbed that power from them, and obviously through the justice system they're trying to take that power back. But with this sexsomnia defence, the perpetrator is essentially being portrayed as an innocent party who lacked the control, rather than illustrating and focusing upon the violent act that's actually been committed. Now, of course, there's a delicate balance to strike between the scientific evidence and protecting the victim. But in the culture that we're living in, where women are frequently disbelieved and have to fight for years for justice, it's a very precarious situation to be in.
And then even when they get to court, there's the fear that the judges aren't trained in this subject either.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think judges are not trained enough when it comes to sexsomnia. I found an interesting comment from Dr. Neil Stanley, who's an independent sleep expert, and he suggested that judges haven't a clue and juries haven't a clue, which essentially means people are chancing their arm to see whether they can get away with a sexsomnia defence, seeing whether it's just worth a try to submit it as a defence and see what happens. Obviously, there's the uncertainty in the science, which means it's essentially impossible to know for sure whether someone was suffering from sexsomnia or not. But I think judges really need to have a better understanding of this issue to ensure a rigorous judicial process. And it leads me to think, do we need specialist judges on this type of issue? Because otherwise, what are we relying upon? Can't rely upon the data.
And of course, the nudge, nudge, wink, wink type headlines of papers like The Sun don't help, because they're reinforcing attitudes that sadly we're seeing increasing with the likes of Andrew Tate, where women are seen as being permissive, being men's property. Men are just men. They can't help it if they have sex, even if they're asleep at the time. Women are always up for it, even if they're asleep at the time as well. So there are repercussions that we need to look at how rape and sex and women are still being treated in society, still being viewed, and get away from, like I said, the nudge, nudge, wink, wink attitude towards it. It's a serious subject.
But I suppose by bringing it into the light in whatever media, the point is if more people know about it, then at least you minimise that risk that we were saying before of the court being sort of titillated by the idea of it. Oh, this is very unusual. I've never heard of this before. This person's a victim of this weird thing. That must explain it. At least if everyone knows more about sexsomnia, you get that kind of communal groan of like, oh, he's not trying that one.
But how long will it take when you're going against centuries of stereotypes of women and sex? I can remember in my lifetime when rape was obviously a woman was just asking for it. I can remember seeing a TV programme, and the next morning at school we all decided she was asking for it, you know, because that was the view of the time. So you're having to overcome centuries of stereotypes around it that, unless we take it as a serious subject, will take centuries again to break down.
Okay. Next up, how 3D printing is playing its part in violent crime. That's after this. Okay, Rebekah, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The rising spectre of ghost guns.
The gun is it believed to be the gun used in the shooting? And there was some talk that it was a veterinarian type gun. Is that accurate?
No, as of right now, the information we're getting from Altoona is that the gun appears to be a ghost gun. May have been made on a 3D printer. The capability of firing a 9mm round, obviously that will come out during our ballistics testing.
An NYC police press conference held on Monday after suspected shooter Luigi Mangione was detained in Pennsylvania. Now, this is a big story, Rebekah, this week. The murder of Brian Thompson, the healthcare CEO in New York, and then the detention of this man who's all over the internet. So why are you bringing it to the table? What have we missed?
Sure, well, as you say, it's probably one of the biggest stories of the week, if not one of the biggest stories of the year. But what I think has arguably passed slightly more under the radar is that the fact that police found what they are calling a ghost gun on the suspect, and they believe that that is the weapon that was allegedly used to carry out this crime. Now, this gun is believed to have been made with a 3D printer, and it's a type of weapon that has grown increasingly common in the past decade. But I think it's going to be catapulted even more into the spotlight in the coming weeks and months, if and when this trial goes ahead. And it leads to interesting questions about the use of these weapons and what hands they can fall into.
Okay, so what is a ghost gun? Sorry, Emma, to turn to you. I've just asked you for an explanation of what is Sexsomnia, but also, what is a ghost gun?
Playing the role of Wikipedia today.
You're our Carol Vorderman.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I take that as the highest compliment. So ghost guns are basically guns that are not officially regulated. So they don't have things like serial numbers. They can be assembled at home. They can be built using blueprints from the internet. Basically, it's a build your own gun. And obviously in more modern times, they can be 3D printed. They became more prevalent in the 90s and then increasingly prevalent in more modern times. In fact, incredibly more prevalent in modern times, as you know, with the rise of the internet and 3D printing and stuff like that.
So hold on. So what was a ghost gun before 3D printing? How could you make your own gun at home without 3D printing? It's fascinating to hear that it's a long-term thing.
Yeah, so basically it's like back in the 90s, it was, you know, a niche hobby. You could basically, you know, buy a do-it-yourself gun kit and sort of put all the various parts together. It could be an innocent thing, you know, from a hobbyist who has an interest in, you know, mechanics and, you know, putting things together, basically very grown-up Meccano.
Yes.
But then basically it's become rather more sinister as this sort of stuff with the internet and 3D printing and stuff like that has become a lot more easy to get your hands on these things. So, for example, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives said that in 2017 they identified and recovered 1,629 ghost guns. As of 22, that was up to 25,785. So they've become much more prevalent and have become linked to a number of high-profile shootings, with the most high-profile of those, I think we can agree, being the shooting of Brian Thompson.
Okay, but, Rebekah, despite how unsettling that will be to British ears listening to this, and we'll get on to what might happen next with ghost guns around the world, in the USA, I mean, we cover this story routinely, the country is awash with guns. It's not difficult to get. You get given guns as a child, as a birthday present in the United States. So does it matter that it's a ghost gun? Really, what's the difference? The issue that they have in the United States is the massive proliferation of guns anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the culture of guns has always kind of confounded me, but I'm British, so it's very difficult, I think, to understand the culture of guns that is in America if you're not an American. But I think the problem with ghost guns, as Emma briefly touched upon there, is the fact that they don't have the serial numbers and the things that we need to kind of track where the guns are going. So essentially, what a person can do if they're using this 3D printer, which can be bought for like a couple of $100, is just put this gun together, this killing machine in an hour. So for me, obviously, there's the fact that there is a proliferation of guns and they can be bought fairly easily, but there have been gun safety control measures put into place, such as background checks. But the fact that these ghost guns can essentially be built in your home like a do-it-yourself project is essentially giving criminals an open door to be able to hold guns, sell guns, etc.
I wonder as well, Elizabeth, maybe whether they hold more appeal to younger people because it has a slightly more glamorous edge if you made it yourself and you have to understand the internet to be able to put one together.
What's fascinated me most with looking into the history is how many of the TV programs I watch have a ghost gun in it. I mean, even Breaking Bad, Walter White is offered the chance to get a legal gun, but he insists on getting one where he takes a serial number off, so that it can't be found and it can't be traced in any way whatsoever. Now, Walter White is one of your main, what they called alter
anti-heroes.
Goodies. Anti-heroes, yeah. Thank you. I like alter goodies. I'm going to call them that from now on.
Alter goodies feels somehow very British.
But he's one of your main anti-heroes, and people are rooting for him. So therefore, the idea that he wants to break the law like this is seen as fine, He's fighting the establishment.
Yes.
And that's what a lot of the cultural aspect around them is. Ghost guns are seen as breaking free from the establishment.
Yes.
You don't need a license. You're fighting against the man.
So my appeal, do you think, to people who basically people who invest in crypto, that kind of person, the kind of person who thinks that any tie-in with the establishment where possible should be avoided, even if they don't need a gun at all?
It does. It's getting this idea that you are using technology to break free of the system, to fight for your own rights, and victims are collateral damage because what you're doing is righteous. You're fighting against the establishment, the man. For example, as I've talked about Dave the Jackal before in this, and I'm so glad it's finally coming to an end. But in the last episode, the Jackal actually looks at his 3D printed gun and says, "You are an artist, Norman," talking about the man who made it. He's looking at this gun as a piece of art, a piece of beauty. And this gun is then used to kill somebody who's trying to transform the banking system to help people break free. But you can't get more sophisticated or charming or anti-establishment, again, as the Jackal. And I was fascinated by how this really does tie in with Brian Thompson's death, because some have hailed it as justice, fighting against the unfair US healthcare system.
Moving it back to the UK then, Emma, do you see this as a pretty scary idea that in future it will be possible for everyone to be able to print one of these at home or at the home of someone they know?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that it seems incredibly futuristic, being able to print a gun at home. But I mean, 3D printers are becoming more prevalent. They're still sort of, very expensive. Not everyone has a 3D printer at home, certainly, but it's the idea that more and more we are able to get our hands on anything sort of through the internet, like sort of access to any sort of items, materials that you really want. And yeah, I mean, even in a country like the UK, which has extremely strict gun regulation, it's the kind of thing that you can imagine that people would be able to find a way around. And I think it's the kind of thing that governments and sort of lawmakers are going to have to try and get ahead of. We're seeing that a little bit in the US now, and I think that with Luigi Mangione having allegedly used a ghost gun to perpetrate the shooting, it's certainly, I mean, it's a news story that's very much over the radar, and the fact that and it links a little bit to the Sexsomnia story, that if something that's been around but has been rather under the radar suddenly gets flung into the headlines, maybe there will be some action taken.
Except the thing is, though, Rebekah, here in this country, unless you're going hunting, you basically have no excuse to have a gun, right? So getting a gun in any way, you're already deciding to do something criminal. So in that sense, it's always been easy to get a gun. Like, once you made that decision to do something criminal, it's no easier to get one via 3D printing than it is to just get one on the black market or to get one on Craigslist or whatever people do. I mean, you've decided to break the law at that point.
Yeah, to a certain extent, but I think that what's really interesting about this story when we're looking at it from an American versus a global perspective is the fact that obviously we've touched upon the fact that America has such a culture of guns, and the way that they're able to possess guns so easily kind of opens the door to just a whole proliferation of 3D printed weapons, whereas the law in the UK is obviously so strict and different.
So what is the law with 3D printing at the moment? Are you committing a crime by printing a gun here or not
in
yet?
In the UK, yes. So in November 2022, they actually updated the legislation within the UK, which means that possessing, buying or producing any component part for a 3D printed gun is against the law, and
right.
it's actually considered to be the same as possessing any firearm at all. So you could go to prison for up to 10 years for holding a 3D printed gun in this country. Obviously that's so vastly different to the situation in America. Obviously you will go to prison if you commit a crime with a gun and get found out, but in the UK it's so different to the extent that even if you just have it in your house as a hobby, for instance, yes, you could go to prison for it very easily.
Does it scare you, Elizabeth?
Yes, it does. I understand the arguments that, anybody can get a gun illegally anyway. But the idea that you can just switch on a machine, or I read in the US they even have build parties where people get together to make their own guns, around the telly one night. I find that very, very scary that we are so lacking loose with an instrument that ultimately its aim is to, injure or kill somebody.
There have been moves in the US to combat the rise of ghost guns. There was an Obama-era law which, was aimed to stop distribution of files online, explicitly instructing how to build ghost guns. That was enacted in 2019, but you can still find the schematics if you look hard enough on the internet. The Biden government called for regulation of ghost guns as well, but we wait to see what will happen under Donald Trump, who has obviously been very close to the NRA, said that he was their best friend when it came to gun regulation or lack thereof. But given there was a private health CEO targeted by a shooter allegedly using a ghost gun, it will be interesting to see what the future holds under the incoming president.
Okay. Up next, the rainbow laced with controversy. That's after this. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the Rainbow Laces row rumbled on.
Hell of a row breaking out over rainbow armbands in the Premier League. And we've got, the Crystal Palace defender, he's written "I love Jesus" on it. We've got a Muslim player for Ipswich who refuses to wear it. And I just think, it's a personal view, but all sport, should try to be, when it's on the pitch, as apolitical as it possibly can be.
Nigel Farage on GB News this week, sharing his thoughts on rainbow armbands. Emma, what is the story?
So, last week saw the Rainbow Laces campaign. It's an annual campaign run by the FA to promote equality and inclusion in football, particularly for LGBT people. It was caught in a few negative headlines after several players either refused to wear rainbow armbands or branded outfits. And then this week, a Newcastle United supporter has been in the headlines because she's crowdfunding to take legal action against the FA, claiming that the Rainbow Laces campaign contravenes their own rules, which ban political messaging as part of kits during games.
Yeah, so this is Lindsay Smith who's bringing the case against the FA. And she argues, tell me if I've got this wrong, that basically because the rainbow armbands and the accompanying flags and paraphernalia that are part of this campaign include references to trans people, that in itself is a political message because you're saying that a person can have a gender that's different to their biological sex. That's a political view, and therefore it's politics, and you're not supposed to have politics and football together. That's basically it?
Pretty much, yeah. Lindsay Smith is an interesting character. She's currently banned from Newcastle United matches until 2026 for harassing supporters and posting transphobic content online. But she's bringing this legal case backed by Sinclair's Law, which is a legal firm which has a long and infamous history of backing various gender-critical court cases, including Keira Bell in the Bell v Tavistock case. There's an article which says that they've raised more than £300,000 for backing cases against trans-inclusive organisations. There's this crowdfunder going on. It's this threatened legal action because of this argument that the FA, by backing LGBT inclusion and therefore by definition backing trans inclusion, is taking a political stance in the opinion of the person who is aiming to bring this legal action, which she has not brought. She's currently only crowdfunding for it, but that is her view.
And so I suppose the argument against would be you can't promote inclusivity whilst excluding trans people.
Yeah, and I mean, there's also there's the fact that, being trans is not political. It's just the way that people are, just as the way that being gay is not political. People are just gay, and that's how they are. I think that seems like a very strong case. And I mean, even if this, enough money is raised and the case gets brought to court, it seems to have little chance of progressing or succeeding. And I think that the main purpose of this case is to keep alive sort of this debate in the newspapers and as part of the culture war, which is unfortunately where the Rainbow Laces, which was a campaign started in 2013 by the FA with all good intentions, has in the last 11 years basically descended into, and has basically become less and less sort of relevant and useful every year, and has basically become more and more of an annual talking point, an annual cultural point, a little bit like poppies have when they're worn on footballers' shirts, or not, as some footballers choose.
Yes. Although, I mean, just as a final point with you before I move on to everyone else, because obviously it's very much up your alley as, a trans woman and a sports reporter. This is something that you're deep in the weeds on.
Yes.
You seem to be saying the Rainbow Laces campaign has served its purpose. But I mean, the purpose, presumably, when you take away all of this fuss on social media and the culture war aspect, the purpose is you're watching telly with your kids, their favourite footballer comes on, he is wearing an armband that says that the sport is welcoming to people. That still seems to be an issue that needs to be said. I mean, that still seems to be, without that being said, something that should be said.
Yes, and it is worth saying that the vast majority of captains in the Premier League, it was over 2 match days up to the 4th of December. And most, captains wore the armbands. I was at a couple of games. I was at West Ham versus Arsenal, and there was a VT shown on the big screen before the game, in which Pride of Irons and Gay Gooners, which are the two LGBT supporters clubs of those respective teams, were interviewed and spoke and sort of talked about the importance. And it is an important thing that, it shows, that football is should be a sport for everyone. But unfortunately, because it's a lot of symbolism, and it's a lot of good symbolism, as far as I'm concerned. But obviously, it is only symbolism, and then obviously there's now become sort of an issue in which it's become more of a culture war talking point, in which it ends up causing controversy, whether manufactured or otherwise, every year. I mean, the FA put out a statement following the end of the Rainbow Laces campaign saying that they were pleased with the vast majority of the players and etc. wearing the armbands and there being no issue. I
mean, I suppose, Rebekah, the point is that it's a value, isn't it, inclusivity, like stand up to racism, which you'd kind of hope that all football teams could just uncontroversially sign up to anyway without making a fuss about, perhaps, without having to come out and parade about it. It's something that just should be a given.
It would be nice, but obviously the Premier League, or football as a sport generally, has a lot of kind of, unfortunately, toxic masculinity driving football historically. I'm a football fan. I've always been a football fan from birth, I think, indoctrinated by my dad.
3 weeks old, there you were.
Yeah.
I love the term indoctrinated.
You know what? There's a picture of me with a bib with my football team on it, so which I won't reveal on the podcast.
Why?
But,
who do you support now? Now you've made me curious. I wasn't before.
I support the best team in the league, which is Liverpool.
Oh, there you are. You have revealed it. That didn't take very long. Do you think this Rainbow Laces campaign is flawed then? What could they be doing differently?
To me, Rainbow Laces has always seemed more like, as Emma mentioned, a symbolic gesture. And while symbolism can be good, I think it's only worthwhile when it's actually translated into meaningful action. So I've just touched upon my football club being Liverpool, and the example that springs to mind is our former captain, Jordan Henderson, who was kind of at the forefront of this Rainbow Laces campaign. He said he was proud to wear the Rainbow Laces, he was proud to be an ally and proud to support inclusion. But then when he left Liverpool and moved to a Saudi Arabian club, that soon quickly went out of the window, and he said that he would not be disrespecting the religion and the culture of Saudi Arabia by wearing rainbow laces. So I think in that sense, rainbow laces just appear like lip service, more than actual action. And I kind of feel the same way about the kneeling on certain match days.
For Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, the point is, Elizabeth, isn't it, that if footballers aren't being given the choice about whether they do it or not, so I mean, exactly as Rebekah says, when you're in the Premier League, you wear it. When you're in Saudi Arabia, you don't. In either case, it's clearly because the owners are telling you that you should, and you're making a stand if you do something different to what they're telling you, then it's pointless anyway, isn't it? It only really means something if someone is making a statement.
I think it only really means something if action happens afterwards. And with the rainbow laces, it hasn't. You know, we don't have a gay football player in the Premier League. Not one. If you
we don't have an openly gay footballer in the Premier League.
Openly gay. That was going to be my follow-on point. Is if you look at the World Cup, for example, you have hundreds of players there, and yet we hear all about the wives and girls. We never hear about the husbands and boyfriends. And you can count on the fingers of probably one finger how many of them have come out and said they're gay. You know, it just doesn't happen. If Rebekah's showing her colours, I'll show my colours. I support a Spanish football team called Rayo Vallecano, and they have put inclusivity into every part of their team, every part of their ethos. You know, they are anti-sexism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia. They do it all, and that is very much part of the team, and that is reflected in the team every game. It's not just a special time when rainbow laces come out, for example. It is one of the reasons why a lot of fans support them in the first place, is for this inclusivity and the idea that the community is everything. Can I also say I find it very interesting how we have openly lesbian football players, but we don't have openly gay football players. I think that says everything about the different cultures of the two games.
But when you say that the team that you support, and I won't attempt to pronounce them, are doing things differently and being inclusive, elaborate on exactly how. Like, what is different, really? Because a lot of listeners, I think, on this, if not other things, will sympathise with what Nigel Farage was hinting at there, which is the common sense view is let footballers play football and then leave everything else outside the pitch.
Well, for a start, I'd like to see Nigel Farage say that about the people who won't wear poppies on their football shirts. But certainly in Vallecas, in the stadium, it is there. It is there in flags that the fans fly, for example, which portray all of the things they are anti. You know, it is there in every game. There is a sign of what this team stands for, and it stands for inclusivity and community. That is part of what it is. They will not tolerate racism. They will not tolerate homophobia. They will not tolerate it, full stop. Whereas if you're only doing that for, a special month or a special game, it means nothing.
And of course, Emma, that's sort of the point of this impending suggested legal action, isn't it? It is to turn the conversation, if there is conversation around inclusivity, it's to turn it into a debate about the inclusion of trans people in that, which isn't something that's being posited by the armband in the first place.
No, I mean, for a start, it's notable that the armband is rainbow and doesn't have it's not progress flagged coloured, which is the one with the little V triangle with the trans colours. Yes, and in the end, it's basically about it's obviously not sort of explicitly saying that trans people should play in this particular sport or that particular sport. It's about sort of diversity and inclusion sort of generally, and basically with this case it's designed to basically create headlines. And I mean, some of the media reporting around this crowdfund has been quite poor. I mean, the Telegraph had it initially and was jumping the gun by saying that the FA is to be sued, as if the money's been made of it. I mean, Pink News, which is an LGBT news organisation, said that they had been sued in the headline. And I mean, you get countless comment pieces about rainbow laces. You get sort of countless sort of talk pieces on platforms like GB News, and it actually touches on a similar thing. The last time I was on this podcast, it was actually with Elizabeth as well, and we were talking about the menopause and sort of menopause campaigners. And in the end, it comes to this same thing that unfortunately we end up coming back to quite a lot, which is that well-intentioned sort of campaigns end up getting dragged down by, cultural discussions, sort of this and that, and sort of debates going circular and nothing really getting done.
Rebekah, how would you like to see this actually change then, as a football fan? Like, what would you like Liverpool to do that they're not doing? Or what would you like them to stop doing that they are doing?
I think, it has to be across the board, across the Premier League improvement. We can't see just certain clubs doing certain things. It has to be kind of a unified effort across the Premier League, I think, to make the whole league feel like a more comfortable and inclusive place. I think accountability is what is really key when we're looking at improving kind of inclusivity within football. We've seen initiatives like the No Room for Racism plan recently delivered its 3-year update, and I think things like that are really positive because they clearly and transparently show the progress that is being made within the league. But I think also it's about tackling the culture, as I mentioned earlier. I think we need to see stricter penalties for discriminatory behaviour within stadiums, for instance, and I think we need to see things like prosecution for hate crime. It's a whole cultural approach in making people feel like the Premier League is actually doing something to help them. And in that sense, I think also to circle back to the league itself, to have further representation in leadership roles in the Premier League. It shows that there's more diverse voices who are seated at the table in positions of power, and policy changes will hopefully reflect the respect that marginalised communities deserve in this sport.
You're nodding, Elizabeth.
I am, yeah. I mean, it's all about the whole culture that surrounds it, and especially when Rebekah said earlier about the macho culture that still exists in football. If we make it into a much more family-friendlier place, then that will be inclusive for everybody, because the behaviour that's allowed to go on now would simply not be allowed. And you're right, we absolutely need stronger bans for anybody using any transphobic or homophobic language. And at the minute, it seems to be very wishy-washy and at the discretion of the FA rather than being something that's imposed every time it happens. So, yeah.
Okay, we could talk about this all day, obviously, but I've got to get off to my son's nativity play, just to introduce my own bit of cultural representation there. My thanks to
Emma. What role is he playing?
Actually, it is a secular nativity play, and he is singing a version of Step Into Christmas by Elton John that's been retitled after the village we live in. So now we know. My thanks to Emma, Rebekah, and to Elizabeth. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, and then tap follow. And remember, just for being a Week Unwrapped listener, you can also get 6 weeks completely free, then save an extra £5 on a quarterly subscription to the magazine when you visit theweek.com/flash24 and use promo code FLASH24. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.